This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 84 of the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. The goal of this podcast is to bring you programs about interesting people doing interesting things in photography. Today's guest is Canadian wildlife and adventure photographer Dan Carr. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, Kirby. How are you?
I'm good.
Excellent.
So please tell everyone about yourself as a person and a photographer.
So I'm originally from the UK. I moved to Canada about 15 years ago, and I spent the majority of that time in British Columbia, but moved up to the Yukon about a year ago. And over my career, which has spanned about, 13 years of that 15-year period in Canada, I have shot of things, including more wildlife and landscape photography.
Okay, good. Well, it must have been hard to leave Whistler. I've never been there, but it's supposed to be very beautiful.
It is beautiful. It's a busy little town, though, and it's a nice change of pace up here in the Yukon. So yeah, it was difficult. I miss it. I'd like to go back down to British Columbia whenever I can. Obviously, that's not really possible the current situation with the virus. But I do miss it. But there's plenty of new opportunities up here as well in the north.
Sure. Okay. Well, one of the reasons I contacted you is that photo on your website of a grizzly bear eating a fish, which looked like it was taken from a kayak. So talk about your kayak photography and how you managed to get close to the bears without getting eaten.
Yeah, it's funny you should mention that, actually, because that photo, which is currently the header image of my website, was taken right at that moment when I was transitioning from sports to more wildlife and landscape photography. And I was looking for ways to challenge myself. I was looking for ways to learn more about wildlife photography. And at the same time, I really wanted to create some dramatic images. So I bought myself a huge super telephoto lens because, eventually if you do a lot of wildlife photography, and you're going to treat it seriously, you're going to need a lens like that. So I just kind of jumped all in and bought one of those, and I planned out a trip to go and photograph grizzly bears from a kayak. Specifically, I wanted to get really low to the water so that you kind of feel like you're more in their world, I guess. So for the listeners, if they, I don't know if you've got show notes, you can include the photo in there or put it on your website or something so they know what we're talking about. But it's a very low angle once you're in the kayak. And so that photo was actually taken on what I would consider to be my first wildlife photography trip. And it was a pretty eye-opening experience, a good learning experience. And yeah, I bought that kayak specifically for that trip. I had it all planned out. I did a lot of research into the kind of kayak that I would want to use. It turned out a fishing kayak is pretty much the perfect photography platform. They're very wide. They have a very wide, stable design because I'm not a fisherman myself, but people that use them might know that fishing kayaks are designed that you can actually stand up in them to cast your rod. So that makes them a very stable photography platform. So I bought this fishing kayak and I kind of devised a way to strap my tripod into it so that I had a gimbal with my camera and lens sitting in front of me, and figured out where I could find some grizzly bears in northern British Columbia, and kind of set out around the time of the salmon run. So I knew that the bears would be out and about and in the water. And it was a productive trip. I got some great photos. I'm proud of that trip, and it was. I look back on it very fondly as kind of the beginning of my wildlife photography.
Yeah, I can see why. What part of British Columbia were you in?
So it's up towards Williams Lake. So it's not the very north of British Columbia, but it's a fair ways up there. It was certainly a good drive from where I was living in Whistler at the time, about 10 or 12 hours north.
Right. Yeah, until I drove through British Columbia, I didn't realize how big a state it was, I guess.
Yeah, it's pretty huge. Yeah. I drove up there when I moved to the Yukon. I packed everything into a truck and made the drive from southern BC all the way up to the Yukon. So yeah, much of the same drive you probably did as you were driving up to Alaska.
Yep, I think so.
Hmm.
So are you still doing the kayak photography, or is that a one-shot deal?
No, I've kept on that. I've bought a different kayak as well. Um, which is a little bit more streamlined and allowed me to go in the ocean. When I was down in BC, that was something else I wanted to do. The fishing kayaks they're good on flat water, but they're open top, so they're not great in rough seas where you would quickly fill up and sink. So I bought a second kayak, which I've used in the ocean, and I've used that up in the Yukon around here in the lakes as well. I love the water, so anytime I can get out on the water with my camera is special time to me. And yeah, I think I'll always continue to use a kayak as a photography platform. It's a very quiet way to move about, and a lot of times you can get really close to wildlife. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So any tips for anybody else that wants to do that kind of photography?
um, the biggest question I get asked is how do you protect your camera? People
Right.
are terrified of dropping their precious cameras in the water. And the problem with this is that there is really no foolproof way to do this once you've got your camera out. I sometimes do underwater photography, and I can put a camera in a fully waterproof housing for that. But for wildlife photography, you can't do that with the long lens. There are no underwater housings that will fit a 500 millimeter lens or a 600 millimeter lens. So your camera is always going to be in some peril if you are kayaking. So the number one thing I tell people is make sure you get insurance and make sure it covers going out on the water, because that's really the only 100% way to protect your camera gear is to have some insurance. Um, but having said that, I have never once thought that I'm going to tip my kayak over. Obviously, if you want to do this, you should be a somewhat proficient kayaker. You should be comfortable in the water and in various weather conditions and things like that. So get yourself comfortable in a kayak before you take your camera out with you. And then just realize that there are some situations where the weather or the water conditions are just going to mean that it is safer to just leave your camera in a dry bag and just tuck it down in the cockpit and don't get it out. I mean, that's it. And then when you've got nice calm water, I mean, if you're sitting in a kayak on calm water, it's very hard to suddenly tip your kayak over. So the only thing you've got to protect yourself against then is simply just dropping it. So just make sure you've got a nice short camera strap that if you did drop it, it's not going to end up in the water. So yeah, just get yourself a really short piece of rope to make a tether, or really shorten up a camera strap so it doesn't have enough length that it falls in the water even if you do drop it.
Any recommendations for any particular dry bag?
I have a bit of a mix. I guess the majority of my ones are from a company called Seal Line. They make various different grades of them. So they do really, really thick, tough ones if you're going to strap them on the outside of your kayak. And then they do much thinner, lightweight ones, which I tend to use if I'm stuffing the camera down between my legs into the cockpit. So yeah, I think they were just sealline.com. And they also make a huge 60-liter, I think it is, waterproof backpack. It's basically just a roll top dry bag with shoulder straps on it. And you can fit your entire camera bag inside that. So sometimes I'll take my huge 45-liter camera bag, which is from Mindshift Gear, and I just put that entire backpack into the Seal Line roll top backpack. So that protects the whole bag if I need to transport it across the water somewhere.
Oh, good idea. Do those things float with all that gear in that, or do you?
Yep, they do.
tie it down?
No, I mean, yeah, I tie it on pretty tight, but if it did fall in, it would float. Yeah, it definitely would. You trap enough air in there when you roll it up that there's a lot of buoyancy in those things. And sometimes I use Pelican cases. Um, I have a few smaller ones which I just clip to the outside of the kayak as well. So yeah, depends
Okay.
what I'm using. You can't really get a Pelican case that will comfortably hold a really big long lens. So I only use the Pelican case if I'm doing wider angle shots.
Sure. So you mentioned underwater photography. I noticed you had done that when you were in BC. So talk about that a bit.
Yeah, this is, I guess, a relatively new part of my repertoire. I first started out doing this last year. I would definitely consider myself to be at the beginnings of that particular sort of discovery. I have a pretty simple setup. I have an underwater housing from a company called Aquatech. Technically speaking, it is actually a surf housing and not a dive housing. So they're not rated to go down very deep. They're only rated to go down to about 10 meters, but they're incredibly robust because they're designed to be churned around in the surf. And a lot of wildlife photographers do use these cameras for kind of surface photography and photography just below the surface as well. So it's a great setup for getting those shots where you're sort of half in, half out of the water. It's a great setup if you're just doing stuff that's close to the shore. And yeah, I started doing that, like I said, around about a year ago, photographing sea lions down in British Columbia. I've done a couple of trips to do that now, and that's been really eye opening as well. Just there's a lot to learn, and I feel like I said, like I'm at the beginning of this particular journey, but being able to get close to wildlife is always fascinating for me. And the coastal wildlife of British Columbia is unbelievable. So to get in the water with these sea lions and have them swimming around, they're very curious creatures. So they come right up to the front of the camera. Sometimes they'll bite, try and bite the front of the water housing, and they'll bite you. I've got videos of me diving down there, and they're sort of chomping on your shoulders and things. Not aggressively. They're just playful. They're like huge underwater dogs. So those trips to explore that sort of coastal British Columbian underwater world have been fascinating. We've always seen lots of other wildlife. We've got the seals and the sea lions, but every trip that I've done, we've also had the orcas come by as well. Not super close. We've always been on the boat at that point, but just it's fascinating to watch them hunt the sea lions and just sort of experience that world that's just a little bit off the coastline. It's great.
So you're scuba diving? Is that what you're doing?
No, actually, with the sea lions, we're free diving. It's quite a bit. I mean, there's pros and cons to both. The bubbles from scuba diving can be a distraction for the sea lions. Sometimes they get a bit boisterous, and with all the bubbles coming out of scuba gear, they can chomp on the hoses and things like that. So that can be a problem. And it's just a really great sense of freedom when you're free diving. So I did a course down in Vancouver, actually, a free diving course to get certified to go on these trips. It was run by a company called Oceanoid in Vancouver, and the lady that runs that company, she does a lot of the dive safety and training on all the movie sets in Vancouver. So that's kind of her thing. She trains people to be safe in the water. She trains people to swim down to pretty decent depths, and gives you all the techniques for learning to breathe. Well, not breathe underwater, but hold your breath for longer periods, so that you can dive down there and spend a bit of time with the sea lions. It's fantastic. I will get into scuba diving, I'm sure, at some point. But like I said, this is kind of the beginning of the journey for this underwater photography, and this seemed like a great place to start.
Yeah. Fewer things to worry about, for sure.
Yeah, a lot less equipment, to get into it. because I'm not going to dive down more than 10 meters when I'm free diving anyway. So that again allowed me to use a simpler, slightly cheaper underwater housing. The dive housings are cheaper than, the surf housings from Aquatech are a bit cheaper than full blown dive housings. So it was just a way that allowed me to get into the underwater world and spend a little bit less money right off the bat. I'm sure I'll end up spending that money in due course, but it was just a cheaper way to get started, and it certainly did the job. I'm really happy with some of the photos I've been able to capture off the coast there.
Changing gears a little bit, you've also done some aerial photography, so talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, I guess because I've always lived in mountainous places, I've been drawn to capturing those mountains from different perspectives, and getting time, whether it's in a helicopter or from some kind of small airplane, to photograph the landscapes from above. I just love it. It's a relatively expensive way to do some photography. So it's not something I can do all the time. I usually have to have a reason to go and do it. But sometimes when I was down in BC, I was hired for commercial jobs that required some work from helicopters and airplanes to capture those mountains and capture the resort. I would do some work for Whistler Blackcomb, which is the ski resort there. So I've done aerial photography of the resort, and it's a wonderful way to see things from a different perspective. And if you go at the right time of day, hopefully in the evening is usually the best time. You can just get some incredible light in the mountains. I mean, capturing those contrasts and that alpenglow from the air is something really special.
What type of lenses do you use for your aerial photography?
Almost exclusively, all my aerial photography has been done with two lenses. So a 24-70 f2.8 or a 24-105 f4 IS. So those, I just find those are perfect. I wouldn't use a prime lens for aerial photography, because what you need to do is change your angle very rapidly. You're often flying along, and the view out of the window is changing very, very quickly. You just don't have the time and sometimes the space to be changing lenses. So using a zoom lens in that kind of standard range, 24-70, 24-105, for me, that's the perfect setup for aerial landscape work. And as for switching between the two, I don't really have a preference. It just, those have been the lenses that have been in my kit at different times. So yeah, it's sort of a standard zoom lens like that is really the perfect answer.
So are you flying with the doors off and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it depends. With a helicopter, flying with the doors off, yes. So that's always fun. You strap yourself in, you wear a climbing harness, and basically strap yourself in with a tether, either sitting on the floor with your feet hanging out on the skids, or if you've got two people side by side. Sometimes I would work with a cinematographer, so one of us would sit on the seat sideways hanging out, and then the other person would be sitting on the floor. And then with a small aircraft like a Cessna, sitting in the front seat and just having the side window flipped right up. You can get some wonderful photography out of the windows like that. You just have to make sure you have really great communication with your pilot. It's very noisy environment as soon as you take a door off or open a window, even if you've got a headset on. So having some sort of pre-planned out hand signals for how you would like them to adjust either the aircraft or the helicopter, that's useful. But either of those platforms is great. Helicopter is much more expensive than using something like a small light aircraft like a Cessna.
Yeah, I've experienced that too.
Yeah.
So you live in pretty cold country, obviously. Talk about shooting in the cold.
Yeah, I mean, down in BC, things in the winter would be relatively mild. A cold day there would be -10 or something like that. Occasionally you get a cold snap that goes less, but now moving up to the Yukon, it's regularly -30. I'm talking Celsius here as well. I'm afraid my on the fly calculations to Fahrenheit are probably not up to scratch, so I'm not going to try and guess those right off the bat. But yeah, it's cold. I mean, it's Arctic cold up here, and you definitely have to be prepared for that. Um, I guess a lot of the preparation comes actually not so much preparation with my camera gear, but what I'm wearing myself, because in a lot of cases, I become the limiting factor. If I get too cold, my hands get too cold, then I find that I don't last as long as some of my camera gear does. Sometimes I've always bought the higher end, professional camera gear when I was a Canon shooter. The more robust cameras like the 1D series and the 5D series, and now with Sony, I have their highest end model, which is the A9 II, and those cameras have always performed really, really well in cold temperatures. So I kind of, as much as I can, remove that worry from the equation by just buying, the most robust camera gear that I can. But yeah, can still be a challenge just to be out there in those kind of temperatures.
Yeah, one of the eternal questions about cold weather photography is what gloves to wear. Do you have any recommendations?
Oh, I have actually, yeah, this one. So when I moved up to the Yukon, I guess side note here, I also have a photography website that is kind of part of my business. It's called Shutter Muse. It's at shuttermuse.com, and I write about equipment. I do reviews, sort of comparative reviews, product reviews, tutorials, and things like that. And when I moved up to the Yukon and things were a lot colder up here, I wanted to find what I considered to be the best photography glove. And so I spoke to basically every company I could find that made photography gloves, and I asked them to send me everything they have. So I ended up with, I'm not even sure how many pairs it was, like 15 or more pairs of photography gloves. And over the course of my first winter here in the Yukon, I tried them all out. And eventually it actually was a fairly easy decision. So the best photography gloves, as far as I'm concerned, are made by a company called The Heat Company. It's not a brand that a lot of people have heard of because they don't tend to do a lot of what I would consider to be more modern marketing. They don't have like an Instagram account with a lot of stuff shared on there, and they they don't seem to advertise a lot. They just rely on referrals from people that love their products, I guess. I think they're a European company. Perhaps they do more marketing in Europe, but in the US and Canada, they're actually imported by a professional photographer called Charles Glatzer. So I don't know if you know Charles, but he was, or he still is, one of Canon's Explorers of Light. He's a very accomplished photographer and somebody that I was well aware of before I realized he was importing these gloves as well. And yeah, he had a good long chat to me about them, and got some on my hands, and I absolutely love them. So I think they were originally intended for sort of military use at some point, and they're these big mitts. They kind of flip open. There's a variety of different liners that go inside them, but they are incredibly robust, unbelievably warm, but also really easy to vary the temperatures that they work with. So I can use them in 0 degrees. I can use them in -40. They're fantastic.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite a recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if people want to read the review, if you've got show notes, then I'll send you a link to my post where I basically reviewed all the gloves that there are on the market, and then kind of concluded that these are the best ones, so people can check them out for themselves.
Sure. I'd be happy to put those in the show notes. How about the feet? Any favorites there?
Not really, to be honest. I haven't spent a lot of time doing comparative tests with footwear. I have a couple of things. I think the ones I'm using at the moment are some winter boots from the North Face. But I didn't do a huge amount of research on those. I just tried on the ones that fitted. and yeah, I've stuck with them for a long time. So I guess I don't really have a lot to offer on that side compared to what I have with the gloves, because nobody as yet is making photographer specific footwear.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned switching from Canon to Sony. Talk about that a little more.
Yeah, that was a big change for me this year. Something that I'd been thinking about doing for a long time, but there's a lot of expense involved in that switch. I have a Canon kit that I have been using for my whole career, and I've obviously amassed a lot of accessories and lenses and things like that. So it all required selling, and obviously when you do that, you take a bit of a hit. So yeah, it was a financial investment to make that switch, but I just felt that Sony's autofocus system for me was a lot better than what Canon were offering. I was able to try out the A9, the Sony A9. I was really blown away by what I was seeing from the autofocus on that camera. And then they came out with the A9 II, which it's not a huge step forward in terms of features, but I mean, if they even made it 5% better than the A9, I just thought, wow, that's going to be even more incredible. So yeah, the A9 II was really, I guess, the catalyst for my switch there. And also the fact that they finally started making lenses, longer focal length lenses. For a long time, Sony didn't really have, it took them a long time to get a 400mm prime. And then after that, they finally released a 600 and a 200 to 600. And when they had those lenses, I knew that they would have the lenses I would need for wildlife photography as well. So yeah, that and the A9 II kind of pushed me over the edge, and I sold all my Canon gear and switched to Sony about 3 months ago now, and I'm ecstatic at the moment. I just from an autofocus perspective, which is what I was keen on, it's leagues ahead of the Canon stuff that I had. So yeah, my only regret is that I didn't make the switch earlier, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. I mean, it's not only different ergonomics, it's different menus and a lot of things to get used to. So
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there would be days when I would say to my partner, Kate, I'd say, I'm going out today to take photos, and what are you taking photos of? I'm just going to learn the camera. I just had to put some time in with the camera. What was shooting, whatever it was. Not even stuff that I would want in my portfolio. Just forcing myself to take photos with it so that I can change that muscle memory of over 10 years of using Canon menus and dials and things like that. Yeah, it took me a good couple of months before I really became confident that I could use the camera basically blindfolded. I really had to put that time in. So luckily, immediately I saw the benefits of it. I was, pleased with the files that were coming out of the camera. So it kind of pushed me to, I guess, push through that barrier to start with, learning a new system. And yeah, couldn't be happier now.
what's the quality of the Sony lenses, and are they lightweight or heavyweight versus Canon?
Yeah, this is a good topic. I think for a while I was not. I've been keeping an eye on Sony for a long time. They're an interesting company. They've been doing interesting things. I was not excited about a lot of their initial lenses. And then they came out with a 24mm prime, 24 1.4 G Master lens. And I started seeing people reviewing this lens and saying this is the best 24mm lens ever made. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Sony lenses don't normally get such glowing reviews. And then after that lens, they made a 135 G Master, which again got similar reviews, and then a 400 2.8. And what I started seeing was that all of a sudden, it's like they stepped up a gear with their lens design department, and every lens from that point forward has been reviewed incredibly well. So I started paying more attention at that point, and I now own that 24mm lens. I own the new 200 to 600. and a new 20mm f1.8, which they came out with a couple of months ago as well, as another new lens, which is just fantastic. So what I'm seeing out of these lenses is absolutely on a par with the best L series lenses that I had for Canon. I mean, if you didn't tell me what camera and lens, the photos were being shot with, I wouldn't be able to tell them apart from any of the best Canon lenses that I had. So that makes me happy. In terms of size, they have a bit of a mix. Certainly the 24 G Master and the 21.8, those are very small lenses. They're much smaller than any of the prime lenses that Canon have for their RF mount mirrorless cameras. And then the 200 to 600 is a relatively lightweight, very hand-holdable zoom lens as well. So I would say that out of all of the camera companies out there making mirrorless stuff at the moment for full frame systems, they're probably making the smallest and lightest lenses as well, which is good. I mean, Panasonic's latest full frame mirrorless lenses are huge. Canon's ones are huge. The Nikon ones are pretty big. So that played a part in my decision as well. They definitely have some small light lens options. And then they also have some great lenses available from Tamron. The Tamron Sony mount lenses have been the best-selling lenses in the photography industry for the last couple of years from the big stores like B&H Photo. And there's a good reason for that. They're incredibly sharp and very lightweight as well. So another reason that I'm happy with the switch that I made, yeah.
What's the cost comparison with other manufacturers?
For the Sony native lenses, it's pretty comparable. A G Master lens is so close to the price of, say, an L series Canon lens that a couple $100 here and there. Once you get into spending those kind of larger amounts of money, I feel like $100 here and there doesn't make so much difference if you're spending several $1,000s. I guess my caveat is that I don't really know the pricing of the lower end Sony lenses. They're just not lenses that I considered for my own work, so I haven't done a lot of research into them, and I don't really know how they compare to the other competitors.
Okay. Well, before we go, let's see, a couple more thoughts. So you have fingers in a lot of pies, so to speak. How do you keep all those going? Are you a one-man band, or do you have a staff? Or
Oh, I wish I had staff. Yeah. No, it's just me. It's just me. Yeah, I mean, I like to keep busy, and I always try and find things that complement each other. So projects that complement each other. If I'm out taking wildlife or landscape photography for one purpose, I then write about that and create tutorials from those experiences to put on my photography website. So usually one project leads to something else. And when I go off to do trips or assignments or whatever it is I'm doing, I try and take new equipment with me that I borrow from B&H Photo most of the time. I have a good partnership with them where they let me borrow stuff to write about it. Or I approach brands directly and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'd like to try out some new equipment while I'm doing this. So I go off and I do my work, and I take extra cameras or extra lenses or tripods or whatever it is, camera bags with me. And while I'm working, I put that stuff to use, and then I write the reviews and various recommendations and tutorials on my website afterwards. So yeah, fingers in a lot of pies, but I try and make sure that they're all sort of complementary. And work well together, and I guess that's how I streamline my time a little bit. But yeah, it's all me. Yep.
Okay. Busy guy.
Yeah, no kidding.
So at what point in your career could you talk these companies into letting you borrow the lenses as opposed to buy them?
Good question. It was pretty early on, I guess, but the niche that I found myself in when I first started out my career, I did pretty well in that niche, and I had some pretty big name clients from recognizable brands quite early on. So I was working with companies like Nike and Oakley and Red Bull. I've done work for Apple and Adobe and things like that. So I think brands trusted me fairly quickly when they saw that was, those were some of the clients that I've had. They were probably intrigued as to, what somebody that's really working with the gear was going to think about their equipment. There's a lot of photography bloggers out there whose primary job started off as being a photography blogger. And I think it's nice that I'm able to give a little bit of a different perspective sometimes, somebody that's been out there doing commercial or editorial work with some of the equipment, instead of just specifically going out to write about it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those kind of reviews are few and far between. So before we go, tell everyone where they can find you and everything that you're doing.
Yeah. On social media, the best way to follow me is just to look for Dan Carr Photo. So I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. It's all the same username everywhere. So at Dan Carr Photo. I'm probably most active on Instagram these days. I like to put the Instagram stories up there, sort of behind the scenes look at what I'm doing. So I would say that's probably the number one place to follow me on social media. And then check out my portfolio is dancarphotography.com. And my website for, all the reviews and tutorials and kind of trip reports that I do is shuttermuse.com. So yeah, I'd love to see your audience come over and take a look at what I'm up to. I'm always open for questions, technical questions, gear questions. Feel free to use the contact forms on the websites, or, message me on Instagram, Twitter, and things like that, and ask me questions. I'm happy to help people.
Good. Yeah, I'll for sure put all those links in the show notes. So thanks, Dan.
Great. Thank you.
It's been great.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Kirby. It was, it's been a really fun chat.
Good. Yeah, same here. So just to let everybody know, the audio version of this podcast can be found on my website at www.flanaganphotos, spelled FLANAGANPHOTOS.com, as well as on iTunes and most RSS feeds. The video version of this podcast can be found on YouTube under Photographing the West, as well as on my website. Thanks for listening and watching. Please tell your friends about us. We'll be back on June 15th with another interesting guest doing interesting things. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you